Hey, yo, what's up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over my updated tier list for the Pokemon TCG metagame. This is going to be the last one for the year, and I wanted to give, some of my final thoughts on where I think the metagame ended up at the very end of 2024. We have a couple of events coming up. We have San Antonio regionals, we have Birmingham regionals, Sao Paulo regionals as well. So plenty of tournaments left in this format, so it's important to keep up to date on where things are. But with that being said, if you enjoy the content, make sure you leave a like and subscribe. And let's hop right into it here. So we got tier S, tier A, B, C, and D. We got lots of different decks right now, one of the most diverse formats we've had in quite some time. There have been some kind of surprise decks that have popped up recently that I'm excited to, kind of talk about. And yeah, all right, let's hop into it here. So we're going to start off here with a deck that has been getting quite some talk. Most recently, won one of the big Champions Leagues in Japan. Now, that was a different format as they had cards like the Budu Legal. However, still pretty similar format to this. And yeah, that is going to be Archlodon. Archlodon is a deck that when it first came out, people thought the card was relatively mediocre. But, once we saw some lists, kind of built with it, and also it having a good Regidrago matchup, it actually has started to pick up a lot of steam, and I actually think is a relatively decent deck. We're going to put at the top of tier B. Having a decent matchup against arguably the strongest deck in the format in Regidrago is really, really nice, and your matchups against some of the other decks actually aren't that bad. For example, you have multiple jamming tower for the Gardevoir matchup, so that matchup is relatively decent. When you play against decks like Dragapult, you have multiple of the Professor Turo, so you can just kind of out heal and tank them. Overall, your attacker is just really strong as well, being able to hit for 220 damage, being able to accelerate also onto the Archlodon with its ability is also really, really nice as well. So you're able to consistently streamline attackers. And you also have that Dialga V-Star with that Star Chronos to be able to finish off game. So overall, I think the deck is pretty good. I will say the biggest thing going for it is going to be the Regidrago matchup. However, you are a little bit inconsistent at times. I think that's one of the biggest things that, kind of holds the deck back. But when you get fully set up, I think you're pretty good. All right. Next up here, we're going to go over... Let's go over Charizard. I think Charizard is a tier A deck. I don't think it's the strongest deck in the format simply because its matchup against Regidrago is just not good. It's just so difficult. So that's like one of the biggest issues with the deck. It's a great deck overall. Fundamentally does pretty much everything well. It's relatively consistent, has good comeback potential. However, it's just that Drago matchup which just not feel very good. If Drago didn't exist, this would be by far, in my opinion, the strongest deck in the format, as it does pretty well against everything else. You're pretty much 50-50 to slightly favored into the, pretty much rest of the format. I would say your Lugia matchup is one that was probably slightly unfavored if they get, fully set up, but pretty much everything else, I feel like you have a lot of control over, except the Lugia matchup and also the Regidrago matchup. So yeah, Zard, I still think is very, very good. Definitely very formidable still. Next up here, we're going to hop into Gardevoir. This is another deck that has been getting quite a bit of hype recently. Most importantly, there are two different variants. They play slightly differently. There is the Secret Box variant with the double rare candy, but there also is the Unfair Stamp slow version, which has been seeing a lot more success recently. Most recently at the Perth Regional Championships, Quito was able to take it down with slow Gardevoir, and then heading into Toronto, the next week, the deck did relatively well. A couple got into top 16. I believe 1 to 2 made it into top 32 as well. So Slow Gardevoir is making its way back into the formats. Having, that Unfair Stamp is just, so powerful. Gaining things like Pheasantipede as well. When Slow, Gardevoir was considered a top tier deck, it didn't necessarily have, access to Pheasantipede. And I think people kind of realized that the Regidrago matchup is not as bad as, some people might think. Also having access to things, like the Mawile as well, to trap, things, like Pidgeot in Charizard Pidgeot, and also, being able to, trap something like a Cleffa in the Regidrago matchup is actually, really, really nice. And I think it gave this deck a little bit more of a surprise factor, and I think it's great. I think it's a very, very good deck. I think that it slots right behind Charizard at the moment. Next up here, we have, let's hop into Dragapult Iron Thorns. Is another deck that has been getting quite a bit of talk and play recently. I think it's just an okay deck. I think it's pretty solid. I think it's the best Dragapult variant out there at the moment, just because Iron Thorns is a really, really powerful card currently, and it, buys you that important time to set up those Dragapults, which is really, really important because the other Dragapult variant sometimes can just get kind of ran over because you don't have really anything to slow them down. So I think that Dragapult Iron Thorns is definitely pretty solid. I will say your matchup against Regidrago is relatively iffy, especially if they do play the Canceling Cologne and they find the Canceling Cologne. Things like Goodra as well are very difficult to deal with. And I will say your consistency problems as well definitely show up. So that's kind of another issue too. So it has some issues, but your matchup against things like Lugia, for example, is good. Your matchups against things like Charizard and Gardevoir are okay. They're not great, but Iron Thorns definitely able to steal a lot of wins just simply by blocking your opponent out of games. Next up here, we got ourselves Raging Bolt. I think Raging Bolt is a solid tier B deck, just a decent run your opponent over as quickly as possible deck, relatively consistent, relatively, linear as well. Nothing special about it. Raging Bolt has been a deck that has been, considered a contender for quite some time. However, I will say that the Regidrago matchup is actually not as good as people think it is. Yeah, like if your opponent knows how to use Radiant Charizard, on the second turn of the game and can, streamline Radiant Charizard potentially like over and over, it can become kind of difficult. Your Charizard matchup is relatively rough. Your Gardevoir matchup as well as unfavored. But I will say that your Regidrago matchup is about 50-50 to slightly favored, and that's probably the biggest thing, going for it. The deck also just is kind of able to steal, quite a few wins just by flipping a lot of heads on, things like Pokemon Catcher, hitting, turn one side as in your opponent had, maybe a, semi-optimal start. So it's very good at, capitalizing on, things that, kind of pop up. It's, yeah, very good at doing that. All right. Next up, we got Turbo Roaring Moon. I actually think Turbo Roaring Moon is actually not that bad. I think that it's better than people give it credit for. I think your Charizard matchup is not actually that bad because how you want to play that matchup is if you're able to get a Gust effect on Pidgey and you're able to Petrant and Judge in the same turn, you turn off Pheasantipity and also get rid of the Pidgey, which means there's a good chance they're not going to be able to get out that Pidgeot EX on the second turn, and you'll be able to kind of just run them over. So I think that your Charizard matchup is definitely a lot better. I do think your Gardevoir matchup is still relatively tough. However, having access to Judge is quite nice. So yeah, I think this deck is, pretty good. I think that the majority of the turbo decks are kind of feel like a tier B deck overall. They're all like relatively decent. However, they, have some flaws. I think that just like the linearity aspect is definitely one of the biggest problems. I will also say that Turbo Roaring Moon does not beat Regidrago consistently. That's an issue. Something like Raging Bolt or Miraidon takes significantly better matchups against it. I would say Roaring Moon is slightly unfavored, which is, not a good thing because you bench so many liabilities against Regidrago. They can just, cure him back-to-back turns in a lot of situations, taking 6 prize cards. So that's an issue for sure because, when you play against something like Miraidon, for example, or when you play against something like Raging Bolt, they have things like Switch Card, Bravery Charm as well, things to kind of push those Pokemon out of the Kyurem range. So that's important to also kind of think about. But yeah, I think Turbo Roaring Moon, solid tier B deck. Next up here, we got Lugia. I think Lugia is decent. I would say that if it sets up, it's really good. However, that's kind of the biggest problem right now. I will say its matchup spread isn't that bad. I will say that Turbo Gardevoir was one of Lugia's worst matchups. However, if people are going to the slow variant, Lugia fares significantly better against that. Your Charizard matchup, I think, is slightly favored if you do get set up and get the turn 2 Iron Hands. If you are going first, then I think you are, favored if you get that off. And your Regidrago matchup is relatively favored as well, as long as you get going. However, the biggest problem with this deck is all the question marks. Whenever you draw that opening hand, you're like, well, there's a good chance it's just completely unplayable, or you squawk into 4 or 5 energies and your deck just kind of falls apart. And that's kind of the issue with the deck, is that if it gets going and it sets up every single game, it might be the strongest deck in the format. However, this doesn't do that. And also with Iron Thorns, specifically Dragapult Iron Thorns, seeing more success, then you potentially have to play something like a Klefki or a Fluttermane in the deck, and then you make your deck more inconsistent versus everything else. So it just, kind of starts to cause more and more problems. So overall, I think that Lugia, when it gets going, has a really, really solid matchup spread. However, the biggest thing holding itself back is itself. All right. Let's see. Let's just go over the last, kind of turbo deck. We got Miraidon. I think Miraidon's decent. I think it's the weakest out of the 3 at the moment. Just, having to rely on generators, can be kind of risky overall. I will say that it's probably the turbo deck that takes the best or second best matchup against Regidrago, but your Charizard matchup's just not very good. Your Gardevoir matchup is not great as well. I don't think your Turbo matchups as well are very good either. Specifically, Raging Bolt doesn't feel great. So I think it's, a solid deck, fundamentally. However, the matchup spread just isn't necessarily there. I do think you do take a slightly favored matchup against, Regidrago. But, there's not a ton else really going for the deck. It's still a solid deck, though, and I definitely expect it to show up for sure. Next up, we got Lost Zone. Lost Zone, I think, is just a tier C deck right now. It just can't really beat Charizard or Regidrago if they get fully set up. Those matchups feel really, really difficult, especially if Charizard plays Unfair Stamp and even something like Manaphy as well. I feel like that, really, really swings the matchup in, that favor of, Zard. Drago, if they know how to play the matchup, is just really, really bad. That matchup's just really bad. We also see decks like Ancient Box starting to see some more play as well. That matchup doesn't really fare, very much, the benefit of Lost Zone Toolbox. So, yeah, there's a lot of problems with the deck right now. I think it's a decent deck, but it just has some pretty rough matchups. Next up here, we got Cloth Terapagos. I think Cloth Terapagos is a tier B deck. I will say it's a little bit inconsistent at times. However, when you get going, you have a really, really powerful deck. Your matchup against Regidrago is relatively close. Your matchup against Gardevoir is okay. It doesn't feel that good. I feel like it is slightly unfavored, to potentially just like 40-60 unfavored. Just because they can kind of just run you over with Screamtail over and over again. However, the slow variant, I will say you are slightly better against than like the turbo variant, because the turbo variant just goes, turn 2 Rare Candy, Gardevoir, Screamtail, KO, and you can just, get kind of just like your board just kind of falls apart, which is not good. But if you can get like turn 1 Poison going first on slow Gardevoir and they miss Evo, you have a shot, but still doesn't necessarily feel good. And your Charizard matchup is just not great as well. So your Charizard matchup and your Gardevoir matchup are not great. And your Drago matchup is about 50-50. So I think those are, kind of the biggest things holding it back. However, it does do really good against the turbo decks. For example, if you play against a Raging Bolt, if you play against a Turbo Roaring Moon, those are matchups where if you get the cloth out, really, really quickly, you actually can just, run them over pretty easily. I will say your Murata matchup is actually not that great, just because they can go 2-2-2 actually relatively consistently. So that's something you kind of have to worry about. But yeah, I think it's a decent deck overall. I think it's probably better than the Turbo decks and Dragapult, but I will say it does have some flaws at the moment. All right, next up here, we're going to go over Goldango. I think Goldango is probably a top of tier C deck at the moment. It doesn't do necessarily anything special. I will say that the best thing the deck really has going for it is going to be the Togekiss, because if you flip well, you can just, kind of steal games that you wouldn't necessarily be able to win without the Togekiss. So that's, one thing kind of going for the deck. But, overall, I think that it's just relatively average. It's, Regidrago matchup is like 50-50 to maybe slightly favorable, but your Gardevoir matchup doesn't feel very good. Your Charizard matchup as well doesn't necessarily feel great. You kind of have to play Togekiss to have a chance in those matchups, and you have to flip really, really well. So there's, kind of a couple problems with the deck. But yeah, I think it's just, a solid deck overall, but doesn't really necessarily do anything special right now, and, doesn't have overall the greatest matchup spread. Next up here, we got Ceruledge. Ceruledge, tier D deck. It's just worse Roaring Moon pretty much every single way. It's just worse, turbo of, pretty much any deck. I feel like it's the only thing going for it is that you can make your board all like 1 prizes on the first turn and then, go into a 2 prizer, but you're arguably the most, linear deck in the format. If your opponent has any way to take a 1-shot on a Ceruledge with a 1 prizer, you just lose, pretty much. So that's kind of the problem like with the deck. I don't think it's terrible, but I think it just has way too many flaws to compete right now. Maybe in the future it gets something that makes it better. Next up, we got Terapagos. One of my favorite decks, unfortunately, I think is a top of tier C deck at the moment. Its matchup against Regidrago is not great, especially if they are playing the Alolan Executor. Your Charizard matchup is also unfavored, in my opinion. Your Gardevoir matchup is about 50-50 to potentially slightly favored for Terapagos, but I think that having rough matchups against Charizard and also Regidrago is just kind of a recipe for disaster in this format, and that's kind of, where like Terapagos is. Now, if we can find a list that sees more success versus those 2 decks, then I think you have a potentially really, really powerful deck. But at the moment, I just don't think the time is right for Terapagos. Next up, we got Dragapult tier. I think Dragapult is a tier C deck. I think that Pult Thorns is just a little bit better. It's a little bit more of a simple deck, feels a little bit less chaotic. Your lines are a little bit more straightforward, and I think you are a little bit more consistent as well. So Yeah, not a whole lot to say about Pult. It just kind of feels like Pult Dusknoir is worse, Charizard Dusknoir. I feel like, Charizard just, being able to take those big, one shots towards the end of the game without, having to rely on something, like Dusknoir, I think definitely, pushes Zard over that. Next up, we got Ancient Box. Ancient Box has been seeing some play recently. I think it's actually pretty decent. I'm going to put it in the middle of tier B. This deck does take a pretty rough Charizard matchup, and your Gardevoir matchup is like iffy. It's like probably about 50-50, but you are decent against Regidrago. I would say your matchup is close. You are really, really good versus all the turbo decks for the most part. I will say your Miraidon matchup is kind of losable if they do hit, turn 1 Iron Hands plus, Bravery Charm, but if you are able to kind of work around that, you should be fine. And like if you're able to go just like 2-2-2, you should be okay. But yeah, I would say your turbo matchups are decent. Your Charizard matchup's rough. Your Gardevoir matchup is close. Your Regidrago matchup is, close. But like definitely like very, winnable. And yeah, I think it's a decent deck overall. I think that Brilliant Blender definitely adds something, to that deck, being able to more consistently reach for those big one shots towards the end of the game. So yeah, overall, the deck is pretty solid. Next up here, we got Snorlax. I think Snorlax is, out of Snorlax and Pidgey Control, is probably the best out of the stall/control variants right now. We'll put it here. I would say that, yeah, I think it's almost considered underrated. I think that its matchup spread is actually not that bad right now. I think your Charizard matchup is about 50-50. Your Drago matchup is about 50-50. And your Gardevoir matchup is about 50-50. Kind of depends on, what you hit off, Misfortune Sisters, Eerie as well, also kind of depends on like the tech cards and stuff like that they're potentially playing. But taking 50-50s against arguably 3 of the strongest decks in the format is relatively solid. Lugia's play rate has also steadily declined over the past couple of months. It's not seeing the play that it used to. You do pretty good against all of the turbo decks except for Turbo Roaring Moon. The Turbo Roaring Moon matchup is definitely pretty bad as they have the Petulant, but you do pretty well against Raging Bolt and also Miraidon. But yeah, I think it's a decent deck. You can definitely take advantage of players who don't necessarily know how to play against it. If you want to improve your Cloth matchup, you can play potentially double Klefki, try and trap certain things in the active, like Petulant potentially. So there's some cool things that you can do. All right, next up we got Pidgeot Control. I think Pidgeot Control is worse than Snorlax just because I don't think that the Regidrago matchup is very good, especially if they play Temple of Sinnoh and Jamming Tower. You just kind of get dunked on. But I do think the deck is decent. Kind of the same thing with Snorlax, as you're able to take advantage of players who don't necessarily know how to play against it. But I am under the impression that the Regidrago matchup and your Charizard matchup and your Gardevoir matchup are all relatively losable and don't necessarily feel great, which is the reason as to why I'm going to put it at the bottom of tier B. But I think it still is a decent deck and will definitely show up and see some success. I don't necessarily know if it has the capabilities to win a major tournament right now, but I wouldn't be surprised to see a few that make it into day 2, maybe getting top 32. Next up, we got the last deck here. It's Regidrago. Now, I'm not always the type of person that puts a deck into tier S. I only put a deck into tier S if I feel like it is so overwhelmingly like the strongest deck in the format. Like it's just so far ahead. And at the moment, I'm going to put it there. There have been, multiple tier lists that I've made where I don't have a tier S deck, but at this point, Regidrago's dominance over the past several months is just undeniable. It feels like it's winning almost every single tournament. Your matchups against both Charizard and Gardevoir, in my opinion, are slightly favored. I think your, Charizard matchup is about 60-40, whereas your Gardevoir matchup is about 55-45, which is just huge. Being able to, be favored into arguably the 2 other, strongest decks in the format. In my personal opinion, the 2 other strongest decks in the format is just so good. I think all your turbo matchups are actually much better than I feel like some people give credit for, just because if you're like able to use something like your Radzard, I think that you can make those matchups relatively close. I think that your Cloth matchup is decent. Your Stall and Control matchups are relatively decent, especially if you play Canceling Cologne, Jamming Tower, and also Temple of Sinnoh. Your Ancient Box matchup is decent as well, and you do really well against a lot of those rogue decks because you have access to things like Kyurem and also Dragapult's Phantom Dive. So you're just super well-rounded versus the majority of the format. You pretty much can go into any game and say, all right, I have a line, I have a chance. And that is the reason as to why we see so many of the top players playing the deck, is because a top player can say, I can turn a 50-50 versus a less experienced player into a favorable matchup. they can even turn maybe a 45-55 or a 40-60 versus a inexperienced player, because there's so much skill expression with your deck, into a 50-50 to slightly favorable as well. That's the biggest thing, is that you have so much outplay potential, so many tech cards, so many things that you can include. It just makes the deck, in my opinion, the strongest in the format. But anyways, that is going to be my tier list, the last one for 2024. Let me know what you think of it in the comments. And yeah, if you have any questions, make sure to leave them down there. And if you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thank you for all the support as well this year. I appreciate it. Hoping to get to 10,000 subscribers over the next month or so. So anyways, thank you so much. This is Smart TCG, and I'll speak with you guys again soon. Hope you all had a happy holidays. All right, cheers.